Good afternoon, everyone. Illinois Extension is happy to host another round of sessions for the Digital Equity Grant Capacity Series brought to you by the Illinois Office of Broadband and the Illinois Broadband Lab. I'm Nancy Wodralgo, State Specialist in Community and Economic Development. We're happy to welcome Devin Bronstein, Director of the Illinois Office of Broadband, who's going to kick off the series today and kick off today's session. Get any of those questions during the presentation into the chat. We'll have a Q&A to follow these presentations with an input period today after our great program. And thanks again, Devin. I'll pass it on to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nancy. Thanks everyone for being here. Again, I'm Devin Bronstein, the director of the Office of Broadband here in Illinois. We're really excited to offer this second webinar series to help prospective grantees build capacity, come up with ideas, start planning ahead of the statewide Digital Equity Grant Program anticipated to launch this fall. So today's topic is building digital inclusion coalitions, and after a couple of slides, I will hand it over to our guest speaker from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, Paolo. We can kick it off with that. So I'll offer some quick context setting. This will be familiar to folks who come to a lot of these sessions. Then Paolo at NDIA will walk through a training on what does it actually take to build a strong digital inclusion coalition in your community. He'll offer some tips and tricks, and then we will close out with a Q&A. A couple of objectives for today. By the end of this meeting, we're hoping that you will understand how digital inclusion coalitions are formed, operate, and continue to develop. We'll hope that you'll have a sense for the different roles and functions that digital inclusion coalitions have, and that you'll get a good sense for what are different coalition structures and roles. So as a reminder, this is the first of 4 webinars in this digital equity capacity building series. So today we're focusing on coalitions. Next week, we are focusing on equity in digital inclusion project implementation, then a deeper dive into grant writing, and finally, how to leverage data for storytelling. So if you're registered for this one, you should be registered for all 4, but just let us know if you need those links. All right, so sharing some quick context. Again, this may be review for some of you, but in case we have any new faces, let's kind of set this in where we are now. So Illinois developed a statewide digital equity plan, which kind of set our goals and our next steps towards achieving digital equity, making sure that everyone in the state has access to quality, affordable internet, devices, and the tools, skills, and confidence that they need to use the internet to thrive in our modern economy. Our statewide digital equity plan was formally approved by the federal government in April. And so now we have this chance to apply for $23.7 million to implement the plan. Within the implementation section of our plan, there are 5 core activities. And one of these activities is for us to launch a digital equity grant program, taking those funds that the state is granted and then offering them up around the state, getting them back into communities. So folks on the ground who have those relationships, those processes in place can stand up or sustain digital equity programming. And so digital inclusion coalitions might be a part of what you could apply for funding to do, hence kind of why we are talking about this today. So this slide shows a deeper dive into what those 5 core activities are. Won't spend too much time here, but we can certainly go back to this at the end if you are curious to hear kind of how else is the state planning to spend these dollars and implement our plan. The statewide digital equity grant program is under development as we speak, following several meetings with many of you and prospective applicants to hear from all of you around what should this program look like, how should we measure success, how should we dole out funding. So if you did participate in those co-design sessions, we really appreciate your time and your perspective. So this is a tentative list of project types that we are considering accepting through that statewide grant program, all to be confirmed and, might be refined slightly And as you'll see, coalition building is one of them. So we're really interested, if there are coalitions on the ground that either are already advocating for internet access in their community, or are looking to stand up and grow a coalition of local leaders, we want to help you with some seed funding. And just a reminder that this whole program is funded by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. This is a federal agency, and so we have to follow its guidelines when we're then implementing our dollars. So this includes prioritizing a focus on covered populations, which are the 8 identity groups on this slide. So when we're thinking of, how we're building our grant program and how you think about how you're going to apply for funds, make sure that you're really prioritizing at least one of these covered populations or more. And with that, that's kind of the context that we're operating in here today. So whether you're planning on applying for a grant from the state in the fall, or you're currently operating a Digital Inclusion Coalition, hopefully this meeting is helpful for you. So I'll pass it over to Paolo Balboa from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Paolo, feel free to share your screen and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Devin. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here presenting to folks across the state of Illinois about, what a digital inclusion coalition looks like, and more importantly, how you might affect this change in your local community. Coalitions exist at different types of geographic levels. So we see coalitions at the city or municipal level. We see coalitions at the county level, in some cases regional, and in even rarer cases statewide. So I'm excited to give a little bit of context about what coalitions are, what the type of work that they do in their local communities, and then I'm going to give several examples of coalition work as it exists across the country. So really quickly, I want to start off by getting to know who you are in the room. I'm going to talk about some digital inclusion definitions, some barriers to digital inclusion. Again, some of that might be review for folks in the room, but I think it's useful to give some table setting around the terminology that we're using, so that moving forward in the presentation, when I reference digital inclusion as opposed to digital equity, folks know what I'm talking about. But the meat of my presentation today will be different types of solutions and different types of coalition models from across the country. And I'll be talking in a little bit more detail around how those coalitions are structured, so that you might have a blueprint to think about as you think about what a coalition might look like for you. So use the chat, please. I'm always curious to see who's in the room. Go ahead and introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, as well as the organization that you are here representing. Just for me, my name is Paulo Balboa. I'm with an organization called the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We are NDIA, which is the nonprofit organization that is national in scope and focuses on digital inclusion, which means that we are different from NTIA, which is the federal agency which is distributing and overseeing the Digital Equity Act program. What brought me to this space really quickly is that I come to digital inclusion work through the public library world. I got involved with the NDIA first as a computer class instructor at the Cleveland Public Library, where I was teaching folks how to click with a mouse or write a resume in Microsoft Word, or apply to jobs. From there, I moved on to the New York Public Library, where I continued that sort of one-to-one digital skills class instruction. And then eventually I landed at NDIA, where one of the first things I did was write the toolkit for digital navigators, which was primarily built upon my work around working with folks one-to-one, but also NDIA, the way we do most of our work is by engaging our national network of over 1,700 affiliates to figure out what does this work like? What does this work look like for you on the ground? And how might we as the national organization listen, learn, and further disseminate learnings and best practices from across the community? So one of those topics is coalition building, which is a slightly newer topic in the world of digital equity, and I think indicates a growth in the digital equity field that we're able to think about how we might engage partners to proliferate digital equity ecosystems across our communities. So we're not thinking, we're moving on a little bit from like distinct one-to-one digital skills classes, and we're thinking more about digital equity as a community of practice. And I'll just note that it is encouraging for me to see on Devin's slide earlier in the context for the Digital Equity Act that building a community of practice is one of the focus areas for the state. That is spot on and encouraging to see Illinois continue to be a leader in the digital equity space across the country. So I'm going to ask folks to use the chat again. Again, this is just, I just want to get people warmed up because I like these presentations to be as interactive and engaging as possible. So put your answer in the chat, yes or no. But my question for you is, if everyone had free access to fast and reliable internet, would that solve the digital divide? I'm just curious to hear folks' thoughts. Let's see, a no. Chris had an answer. It would not solve it, but it would definitely improve it. Yes, I think that is spot on. It would not solve the digital divide. I see a lot of no's. Over time, yes, sure. Education and tools are needed. Thanks. So I've been doing these types of presentations for a little under 4 years now. And let me just say that when I joined the digital inclusion community more formally in COVID, like March 2020, answers were a little bit variable to a question like this, right? So seeing folks' responses in the chat, just a smattering of no's, again, just indicates that like how far the community has grown and how bigger the tent has gotten as far as like people's understanding of what this work looks like. So that being said, I usually take that as a temperature read to figure out if I should go through my definitions portion of the presentation a little bit faster or a little bit slower. I'm seeing that folks have a pretty firm grasp based on that question in the chat. But really quickly, just some table setting. I'm going to go over some definitions to make sure that, again, we're all using the same sort of language and that we're all on the same page throughout the course of this presentation. But also, and I might ask you to begin to think like, the topic of today's call is about coalitions. A lot of the coalition work, which I'm going to get to in a bit, a lot of coalition building involves engaging new types of partners who might be doing digital equity work, but don't necessarily define their work as such. In other words, someone might be doing digital equity work, but they just have never heard that term before. So I like to go through these definitions as a way to, again, like table set for our presentation today, but also do a little bit of modeling for how you might engage partners in describing to them what this work is and why it matters to them. So the first definition here is the digital divide. This is more than likely the term that you have already heard or are already familiar with going into today's call. It is more than likely already the term that folks in your community are already familiar with. The digital divide we define as the gap between those who have affordable access, which was mentioned in my question slide a few slides ago, but it's not only affordable access, right? It's skills and the support to effectively engage online. Effectively here is sort of like the operative word in this phrase, right? What do we mean by effectively? I would define this as, thinking back to my previous life as a computer class instructor as a library, I would define this as like if someone didn't need my help. Like if I had been previously helping a person get online and get access to job benefits and check their email, if I saw them one day and they were suddenly like, I think I got this, right? I don't think that I necessarily need your help with this. I would define that as effectively engaging online. In other words, they have some sort of agency when using the internet and don't necessarily need me in the scenario, right? Like the computer class instructor guide to sit with them and describe everything that's going on with the internet, right? Obviously, I'm still there, but they have some sort of agency. Now we get into sort of the more meatier definitions of our work. So we know what the digital divide is. We know that the digital divide means that there is a gap. The question then becomes, if there is a gap, where do we want to get folks in our community to? Digital equity is the goal. So this is the condition where all individuals have the technology capacity needed to participate in society, democracy, and the economy. So folks are able to use YouTube to find tips on gardening. They're able to sign up for government benefits. They are able to register to vote, for instance. They're able to list something on eBay in a framework of digital equity. Organizations like ours exist, and the Digital Equity Act grant exists because we know that not all community members are here, are in this framework of digital equity. So we need to do work to get folks in our communities to this framework where they are able to fully participate in society, democracy, and the economy through the networks online. Just before I move into how communities might get there, I like pausing on this graphic to talk about the differences between equality and equity and why we at NDIA focus on digital equity rather than digital equality. And I think that this graphic is a helpful highlight or helpful illustration into what that difference looks like. So equality, this image on the left is focusing on the books allotted, in other words, the assets allotted to each community member. So equality, we see on the left, is giving the same amount of resources or assets to all community members. We know that some community members begin at a different threshold than other community members. So are we only enhancing inequalities by just simply doling out the same amount of assets to all community members? We might be furthering we might be increasing inequalities by simply giving out the same resources to everyone. This is where we focus on equity. Equity is a little bit more hard at work. Equity requires us as representatives of the organizations that are on this call. It requires me as a representative of an organization at the national level. It requires the state. Anyone who wants to address digital equity, it requires an element of engagement and understanding what the barriers to digital equity are, and then giving resources as appropriate to communities based on what their needs are. So a lot of our work in digital equity requires a lot of strong ties with a community. It requires a lot of trust in order to get folks to help us understand what their barriers to digital equity are. So how we do that, this is where we get to digital inclusion, right? So if there is a goal of digital equity, we want everyone to get to this framework where all participants can participate in society, democracy, and the economy online. The question then becomes, how do we do that? And that is through these various activities. So affordable home broadband. The Affordable Connectivity Program was an amazing example of how we might address affordable home broadband. So for folks who are familiar with the ACP, that is where that slots in here. There's also appropriate devices, digital skills, tech support, and applications. I'll be talking a little bit more about each of these elements a bit more later on. So I'd mentioned some key barriers to digital inclusion. I have another audience participation opportunity here for you. So again, I want you to use the chat and list out some of your thoughts here based on this question. What prevents people in your community from consistently connecting to the internet and using it effectively? So we're building on a previous question, which simply asked, if we gave everyone free internet, would that solve the digital divide? Answers were mostly no. But now I want to dig a little bit further here. So again, what prevents people in your community from consistently connecting to the internet and using it effectively? See, Clay says cost is number one. Knowledge, lack of computers and phones, cost and connectivity, unreliable connection, lack of search skills. As far as efficiency of use, age and accessibility, lack of internet access, device access, right? Kathleen says we have an older population that does not understand how the internet works or how to utilize it. Intimidation, language barriers, poor internet connection, insufficient access. It's as if you all created this next slide for me, right? So here are some of the key barriers as reflected in your responses in the chat. So again, those elements of digital inclusion, which are broadband, device access and affordability, digital skills. Here are some of the more frequent responses that we have heard in our work from folks who are working directly with community members around like what their barriers to digital inclusion might be. For folks who are familiar and well versed with your state's digital equity plan, you might see a lot of these same barriers reflected in the state's plan as well, right? So what prevents someone in Joliet, for example, from reliably accessing the internet or reliably using the internet, even if they already have access? Some of those might be couched in digital skills, right? There might be limited skills, there might be fear or shame, there might be inaccessible trainings. As far as devices, the device might not match to what the user needs the device to do to participate on the internet. So again, we're going to the solutions, which is for digital inclusion. This is the road to digital equity. It is the current analogy that we're using around digital inclusion. It used to be the three legs of the stool. But again, as the community has grown and as the work has evolved and adapted to include best practices from other similar related fields, we're describing this as a road to digital equity. So last bit before we get to coalitions, I want to talk a bit about one type of program that works as a solution for each of these barriers to digital inclusion. That's one called Digital Navigators, right? So let me know in the chat if you have arrived at this webinar having already heard the term Digital Navigators, if you're already familiar with it. Just curious to know. But Digital Navigators is a program that NDIA at the beginning of the pandemic, we worked with our community to figure out how our folks in our community who are working regularly with members of the public, how are they adapting their services to the changing needs of community members at that time, specifically in the pandemic? Digital Navigators has now evolved to focus on to have specialized programming that focuses on rural areas. There are Digital Navigator programs that focus specifically on tribal areas across the country. There's also Digital Navigator programs that have a specific topic or field focus. So health navigators focus on the healthcare field, or workforce navigators. We're thrilled to see this model proliferate and adapt based on what a community needs and what expertise already lies in a community. So for folks who weren't familiar with Digital Navigators, as we define it, are trusted community members who consistently provide holistic, individualized support through repeated interactions. I'll just use my past as an example here. Right when I was working at the New York Public Library, I would sit behind the circulation desk, and my expertise was with technical support and technical skills. And I was there for any community member who, when they walked through our doors, would ask for help, let's say, getting into their email because they forgot their password. I have great experience with this because my parents are retired, and I will frequently, continually receive texts and calls from my mom asking me what her Facebook password is, and I'll be like, Mom, we have to get through this. Let's get on a call. Let me walk you through this process so that eventually she will have the agency to be able to maybe not give me a call the next time she has a question, right? Like, she has the agency and the skills and the knowledge necessary to be able to interact on the internet confidently on her own. So digital navigators typically live in trusted community anchor institutions such as a public library. A digital navigator can live in a social service agency that already works one-to-one with community members and already has a familiarity and understanding of what a given community's needs already are. So one example, there are dozens of digital navigator programs that I could highlight, but one example that I wanted to highlight for our call today is from a lesser resourced part of the country. And I want to emphasize that the examples that I'm pulling on today are mostly from lesser resourced parts of our community. Bigger cities, like I can pull on a digital navigator program from the city of Boston, but I wanted to make sure that I pull on that I describe types of programming that might be relevant to folks who are coming from across the state of Illinois and not just the more highly populated areas. So the example that I want to share here is from a regional organization called Shaping Our Appalachian Region. They are in Eastern Kentucky, and they have a digital navigator program where they do all the digital navigator stuff, right? They provide one-on-one support for devices, digital skills, and support securing hotspots for residents in the Eastern Kentucky region, which spans across 6 counties. It is Appalachian. It is defined as Appalachian, defined by the ARC, the Appalachian Regional Commission. Um, and as a result, in their program design, given that this is a less densely populated region of the state, they have built into their program costs a travel budget. So their digital navigators drive from place to place across the 6 county region, and they've usefully thought ahead and built that into their travel costs. They initially thought that, okay, it might be useful for a digital navigator to be more static and live in maybe the most populous county across the 6 county region. But they realized that the needs of their community, the barriers to digital equity for their community could be transportation, right? Someone might not have a car to be able to drive 30 minutes to 45 minutes to go to a specific location. So the digital navigator in this program model, they are the mobile one. They're the one who's making appointments throughout the week, and they're driving from place to place, and most importantly, meeting the community members where they are. This is a 3-year pilot, and they are just ending their first year, I believe. But and this is the first of its kind, right? That in which the digital navigator is purely mobile across a pretty big region. So we're seeing results start to come out of this program, and I wanted to, recognizing that Illinois is not Appalachian, but recognizing that like there are some parts of the state that are less densely populated than others, and that distance and geography is a barrier. I don't want to dance around that. So I wanted to share an example of at least one type of program model that is adapted to the specific needs of a given community. That's just one example. We have a repository of different types of digital navigator models hosted on our website. I can add the link in the chat at the end of my presentation. On the right side of this slide as well is an hour-long webinar hosted by my coworker Abby Waldrop, which goes into more detail around what digital navigators are and how the model proliferates. I wanted to share that first because that digital navigators represents one type of capacity building solution, right? So going back to the slides that Devin presented at the top of today's call, building a community of practice, building stakeholders and partners are some elements that are priorities in the Illinois State Plan. Another type of capacity building is this more holistic type of capacity building that is not just a singular one-to-one program that, while is amazing and great, right, and definitely helps the needs of community members, we want to begin thinking about how we might sustain this work in a more equitable way if and when, right, more when the Digital Equity Act money runs out. So thinking now about building strong digital inclusion ecosystems is critical. And part of that, and one of the elements of building a strong digital inclusion ecosystem is thinking about coalition building. So you're in a good place now, sitting on this call before the grant money is available, while you're thinking about your proposals and what they might look like, because you're in now at the very beginning of this, thinking about how you can sustain this, and coalitions is a very strong vehicle to sustain the types of programming that you might be providing throughout the duration of the capacity grant cycle. So first, what is a digital inclusion ecosystem? An ecosystem is a combination of programs like digital navigators and policies, like for instance, a local digital equity plan that meet a geographic community's unique and diverse needs. So coordinating entities, and this is where we get into like the stakeholder partnership piece, coordinating entities work together in an ecosystem to address all aspects of the digital divide, including those elements of digital inclusion, right? So affordable broadband, devices, and skills. So our goal is to build strong digital inclusion ecosystems across the country so that we can sustain this movement far beyond the Digital Equity Act. just an idea of what one element of a digital inclusion ecosystem looks like. That's digital inclusion coalitions. So this map here, and there's another graphic and a few slides that I'll share here in a bit. But these data points that I'm presenting to you are snapshots from a survey that my organization, NDIA, distributed to our community in late 2021, early 2022, in which we wanted to figure out where are coalitions and what types of work do they do. So I will note that again, this map, and then in a few slides, a bar graph, these data that I'm sharing are from 2022. I fully recognize that there are a number of new coalitions that have popped up across the country. So this isn't necessarily current and up to date. However, I'll just plug that we are currently revising our coalition survey, and we expect to reshare with our NDIA community and through our networks in early September, so that we'll have not only a more accurate snapshot of where coalitions are, but also a searchable database so that you might be able to find who is doing coalition work locally, along with associated contact information, websites, about what that particular coalition is doing. So digital inclusion coalitions are a collective of organizations that work collaboratively to raise funding for digital inclusion programs. They raise awareness about digital inequities and the impact that those inequities have on their communities. And again, they raise funding for digital inclusion programs while furthering strong digital inclusion policies locally. The types of work that coalitions do, we've laid out their work across 3 different pillars. So they are the advocacy effect, the alignment effect, and the network effect. So beginning with the advocacy effect, this is the awareness pillar, right? So coalitions raise the profile of digital inclusion for their community's media, opinion leaders, and the general public. In other words, they let people know in a given community that this is a type of work that exists. This is a community of practice, and here are several organizations or individuals locally who have been thinking about this work and how this type of work might affect change for good in a given community. Next is the alignment effect. This is the pillar that gets at the idea or the reality that some organizations, and yours might fall into this category as well, but some organizations might feel a little bit siloed in their work. I think again about public libraries, for instance, even the New York Public Library, which is a huge, gigantic library. Even we felt quite siloed in our city as far as like what other types of related programs are going on, and also how might we get connected with them. We felt like we were operating in a bubble alone. So one way that the New York Public Library, for instance, got out of that silo was by engaging with a strong existing local digital inclusion coalition in New York City. So that gets at this idea here in the alignment effect, which is that coalitions create a framework to align the perspectives of community players that share a concern about digital inclusion. The result of that is this last category, or this last pillar, which is the network effect. So coalitions setting the stage for member organizations to better understand each other's perspective and discover opportunities for collaboration. Another way of saying this is that libraries, for instance, which may feel siloed, might not have the resources, the staffing, or the capacity to, let's say, turn on a digital navigator program tomorrow or next month, even if they wanted to, even if they know that they have the subject matter expertise, they have the know-how, they have the space to be able to do digital navigators in the near future. They might not have a direct relationship with a certain population that they might want to reach. They might not have all of the pieces of the puzzle effectively. So coalitions help solve for these differing pieces and these missing puzzle pieces that one organization, as big as it is, alone can't solve for. So again, building a community of practice, but also sharing resources and sharing capacity is a way that coalitions can help address some existing realities for some organizations, even the biggest ones. So again, just a brief snapshot. Again, this is from our 2022 survey, so not super current, but just to give you an idea of who or what types of organizations are involved in coalitions. We see here that nonprofits by far and beyond are leading the way here. One of the things that we hope to do in the survey that we are revising currently and expect to release later this fall is to sort of like disaggregate what we mean by nonprofits, like what types of distinct, for instance, social service agencies are involved in this work. You'll see below libraries as well as higher education are, again, typically the types of organizations or institutions that are involved in coalitions, local government, and then we get into some more categorical types of organizations here. So like workforce development, economic development, health, housing are examples of types of organizations that are typically involved in coalitions because they see digital inclusion as like key to their mission, and they have been engaged in shown to see that this already aligns with the type of work that they're doing. You'll see that philanthropy is not an insignificant representative of like types of coalitions here, as well as for-profit organizations, which would include, or a little higher up is internet service providers. So happy to talk in a little bit about like how different types of coalitions have engaged internet service providers locally in their community. Some coalitions do allow internet service providers to be members, some don't. Those are decisions that are made at the coalition level, right? So happy to talk a little bit more about what that might look like. Just seeing here. Okay. So a little bit about the structure of digital inclusion coalitions. So starting at the top here, right, like coalitions, their focus is always going to be on their community. Coalitions define their community or in other words, their geographic reach based on who their stakeholders are, right? And what the geographic reach and population reach, importantly, of its members encompass. The focus of a coalition will be defined by its members. Moving further in our concentric circles image here, the coalition itself is reflected by the collective. So these are all of the member organizations and in a lot of cases some individuals who are joining on behalf of themselves and not on behalf of the perspectives of a certain organization. But these are the folks who are engaged with the coalition and who have dedicated time and effort into furthering digital equity for their community. These next three sections here for task force leadership and backbone, I really want to focus on because this is where we see a lot of like the effort and work coming out of coalitions. This is like the administrative, the structural elements of a coalition. In other words, how does it actually work? So one popular method that we see a lot of coalitions working through, depending on what they call it, is through this method through like a task force or a working group. In other words, a coalition might, in order for a coalition to move forward, right, and in order for it to get through its list of action items that it has at the end of each meetings, typically coalitions will distribute its action items across different task force or working groups, different topic areas that coalition members can self-select into. So for instance, if there are several coalition members that have a strong, that organizationally they represent organizations that have a strong focus on device distribution, then device distribution will be its own working group, and those coalition members who are all hyper focused on that one topic area can get together and push forward initiatives that are solely focused on device distribution. Same can be said about other elements of digital inclusion work. So if there are coalition members who are specifically focused on digital skills or digital navigators, if it's a little bit more evolved, then those coalition members that meet distinctly in a working group outside of the regular coalition, outside of the regular larger coalition meeting, and get together and again share resources, think through capacity building initiatives, so that they might be able to further the missions of their own organizations that they're representing. I'll note that another type of coalition working group or task force that has been emerging are working groups that focus specifically on policy. which are important to consider, especially given that one of the goals of building a strong digital equity ecosystem is not only to develop programs by sharing capacity and resources, but also to further digital inclusion policy in a local community. So task forces are one way to sort of distribute a wide breadth of work in a well-organized way. Underneath task force or actions is typically a leadership. So some coalitions call this a steering committee, some coalitions call this a guiding group, but these are typically a smaller group of representatives of coalition members who represent organizations at the decision-making level, who can not only share the actions of the coalition with each of their organizations, but also affect change in each of their organizations in order to further digital inclusion through their organizational change. So we're talking here like directors of libraries, other leadership positions at related organizations like a local housing authority, a local school, a local university. So again, these are decision-making leaders who, again, form what is typically called like a steering committee or a guiding group. Then finally, there is the backbone or support organization. Usually this is the funder. So in a lot of cases, pre-Digital Equity Act, the backbone organization looked like a philanthropic organization. This is an organization that has already bought into digital equity or has been shown that digital equity is in line with their existing mission, vision, and values. In the case of the Digital Equity Act capacity grant going live, the backbone organization changes in a lot of these cases. So if thinking about what a coalition might look like locally, the backbone organization might be an organization that has experience handling large federal grants, as well as like having the administrative capacity to organize meetings, provide space, buy snacks for meetings, other things like this. So really briefly, an example of some coalitions in practice. The first example that I'll share is called the Y Zone. This is from Yonkers, New York, which is outside of New York City. This does represent a more urban example of a coalition. I have other examples that I'm ready to share. But in this example, the Y Zone initiative establishes a digital equity ecosystem, which is driven by the coalition, which is made up of local stakeholders. The local stakeholders including the City of Yonkers, the Yonkers Partner in Education, which is a local nonprofit, Fordham University, which is based in Yonkers, the STEM Alliance, which is an active participant in our community, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, as a way to house their Digital Navigator program. So some of the actions that the Y Zone initiative does is it helps eligible residents receive free or low-cost digital resources through each of these partners. So again, they're pooling resources, and they collaborate with the community to identify adoption barriers and needs. Another type of coalition that I'll share is from Greater Cleveland. So this is Cleveland, but also including the surrounding Cuyahoga County as well as Lorain County, which becomes significantly more rural, but it includes this Greater Cleveland region. So I like to highlight this example because, although this coalition launched officially in 2022, a lot of the member organizations, including the local philanthropy, the Cleveland Foundation, as well as all of the public libraries in each of the surrounding cities and counties, had already been engaged in digital equity work in some capacity, but they just finally described themselves as a 501c3 nonprofit in 2022. So they were building upon existing assets and expertise before officially launching their website. One of the first things that the Greater Cleveland Digital Inclusion Coalition did was it did community asset mapping. So for folks on this call who were tied into the state's digital equity planning process, you might be familiar with the asset mapping process. Devin and folks at the state essentially gathered a list of organizations and programs that do digital equity and put those into the state digital equity plan. What we would highly recommend if folks are considering starting a coalition is to build upon that asset inventory that the state already did and to do that survey again, but locally. Inevitably, the state at its higher level might have missed some programs and some organizations that you just already know about a little bit more locally. So gathering those assets and figuring out who is doing what and what's already working will help you figure out not only who potential stakeholders might be, but also what types of programs a coalition might develop and enhance if given a bigger pool of resources and capacity. So I know that I mentioned two more urban examples I wanted to share again, specifically for folks across the entire state of Illinois, that an emerging trend is that we're seeing regional leadership in lesser resourced areas. So each of these examples comes from the Appalachian region. Again, not fully recognizing that Illinois is not Appalachian, but recognizing that there might be some similarities in less dense geographies and also lesser resourced areas, right? So the first example that I'll share is from an organization called Drive, which is a regional economic development organization in central Pennsylvania, which is working currently to develop a local asset mapping tool. So this is an example that I want to share because it shares an example of how economic development organizations or um, economic development focused entities might be involved in the digital equity work, and furthermore, how they already have a little bit more of those resources and capacity in order to serve as that backbone organization that I was describing a few slides back. Similarly, the Thrive Regional Partnership, which is based in Chattanooga, but serves the surrounding Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia tri-state area, is an example of a growth-minded nonprofit that leverages cross-sector partnerships across different types of topics, such as transportation, other types of infrastructure, but also broadband and digital equity, to build coalitions at the regional level, but also to help build coalitions locally for each of the communities that they're working with. And finally, Generation West Virginia is an example of a workforce development type agency getting involved in digital inclusion work and again, serving as that backbone organization. Generation West Virginia is statewide, but what their work is important because they're currently helping each county in West Virginia not only write digital equity plans, but as a result of that digital equity planning process, which involves a variety of stakeholders and a variety of community engagement, building a coalition based on that digital equity plan process. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions. But further, I know that might sound like a lot, and if you're wondering like, oh, it would be great if all of this information were in one place that I could read on my own time, and when I'm not just like reacting to it right now on a webinar, I'm happy to share that all of the information that I presented on is available in a resource called our Digital Inclusion Coalition Guidebook. I know that the slideshow is being shared out after this presentation. So that link that you see on my screen here is live. You'll be able to click through and read through the guidebook. There's also a lot more detailed information around the structure of coalitions and a lot more information around like elements that a backbone organization, for instance, might already also have. So I just wanted to share this because there's more to learn, and a lot of the information that is found in the guidebook was based on conversations that myself and my coworkers had with different types of coalitions, that represent different types of geographies and different types of populations across the country. Additionally, another type of resource that another program that we oversee is our annual program called Digital Inclusion Trailblazers. Again, this link is live. Trailblazers is a program in which we every year take a measure of what excellent digital inclusion work looks like across the country. And the way that we do that is that we ask applicants to submit a variety of resources that demonstrate digital inclusion work on the ground. One of those resources that we ask folks to submit is evidence of coalitions. And furthermore, we ask folks to, if submitting evidence of coalitions, we ask if they might be willing to share some more discrete information like coalition budgets, staffing, job descriptions, any more like detailed resources that might be useful for you to you as you're thinking about what a coalition might look like locally. You can find in our resource repository, which is housed on our Digital Inclusion Trailblazers website. So the last bit, if any of this was remotely interesting to you and you would like to go more than this, and you would like to learn more, then this is my pitch to join our NDIA community. It is free. You get access to our listserv, which is very. Some days it's overwhelming, but it's very active, and it's the purest example of a community of practice that we aim to build across the country. So with that, I'm going to send it back to Devin, I believe, and happy to answer any questions or.
Great. Well, we have about 6 minutes, so any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or shout them out either for Paolo or for our state team. I'm looking in the chat, not seeing anything from earlier, so we will just let you ask anything live.
I just want to say thanks as well. Participants are also unable or are able to unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question, and not take the time to write it in the chat as well. I will say that digital equity has definitely been, something that we find when we're speaking with communities that they're still struggling with definitions and sort of wrapping their mind around what digital equity can be. And I really liked how you kind of approached it in the beginning with explaining that if digital equity is sort of a hard word to continue to use in the planning activities and the coalition building activities, that it can take another form, right? Like, um, I wonder what examples you've seen out in the field in terms of digital solutions for quality of life issues in communities, historical quality of life issues that can really just shift the focus towards like a focus towards like an aim, um, that entails digital inclusion activities.
Sure, that's a great question. One of the phrases that we saw emerge, especially in the state digital equity planning process from across the country, is states using the phrase digital opportunity, um, which essentially communicated the exact same thing, but was more in some perhaps more politicized areas, more palatable to potential stakeholders. We've seen other communities go as far as to describe this work as like community connectivity, which in those cases encompasses both broadband planning and digital equity planning, and presenting them as two halves of the same whole. I mean, for our part, like we like the definitions because we like everyone to understand what digital equity and inclusion means, but ultimately that's our suggestion from the national level, and whatever language is most appropriate for the communities that folks will potentially be working with, we would suggest using that.
Thank you. Yeah, we find the issue also with broadband. It sometimes is like a non-starter for community leaders that have been serving the community for quite a while to start to talk about broadband in like in more operational way for the community. And do we shift that conversation into talking about telehealth or into talking about something else? But yeah, thank you for that. I personally want everyone to know what digital equity is as well, but what does it mean when it's operationalized in our communities? And I see we have some questions in the chat too. What would you say the very first thing to do? What would be the very first thing that you would need to do to start a digital equity coalition?
Yeah, I thank you for that question, Anita, because that actually gets to something that I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail with folks here, like especially in regards in the context of the state capacity grant, like excellent to see that coalition building is a priority for the state of Illinois, right? But recognizing that building a coalition means engaging different types of partners and getting information out there. Like it is, this is something that we were doing a lot of work in West Virginia recently, which is lesser resource and spread across the state, less dense. What we were seeing a lot there, and as a result of those conversations, is that coalition building counts as a capacity building strategy, so that like if the reality of a given community now is that you want to plan a kickoff event in 4 to 6 months and that will be the beginning of your coalition, that's great, right? Like if the first step is getting people in the same room in order to have, let's say, a kickoff or a workshop, and presenting essentially like slides around like what this is what digital equity is, this is what digital inclusion means, just to gather some enthusiasm around this work, then that is an excellent example of capacity building and the beginning of a coalition. Um, Devin might agree with it. I don't know. I just that's what we were saying from the West Virginia standpoint. Um, but like planning a meeting months from now is what I would start with.
Yeah, I mean, you're the expert. I think it's that like tapping into and convening people who already have some stake in the end goal, and adding some structure, rules, and clear responsibilities, and then kind of collectively crafting goals, a guiding question, a mission, jumping off from there. I see we're at time. I might have to hop, but if Paolo, you want to stick around for another 2 minutes or so, um, please take it away. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Devin. Yes, Paula, we do have another question in the chat around what types of organizations do you most see as the lead of coalitions?
Yeah, I just anecdotally, I typically see the local public library as the lead of a coalition, and there's a few reasons for that. Like libraries have like administrative capacity; they're usually bigger organizations than other members of coalitions. So not only does this mean that they might have some familiarity, potentially some expertise with uh, working with bigger grants, but also libraries are just like in a given community the trusted source. So like everyone knows what the library is. More importantly, libraries have the space to they usually have meeting space in order to have an initial convening. So libraries typically I see as already understanding that they have a stake in digital equity, but also having a little bit more capacity than other types of organizations locally to sort of kick these things off. Eventually, that might live somewhere else. We have seen it transition to another organization that can do this or has a little bit more interest in this being their sole job. But at least at the very beginning, I see libraries being sort of like the arbiter for a coalition kickoff.
Thank you. We have one other question at this time. If you could expand on the fears that users may have using the internet. Is it more about cybersecurity and the tracking of one's site searches or the ads that can sometimes bombard a user? What do you see as the reticence that users may have in some of your experiences around the digital navigator space?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that like it's fear, but that fear is couched in uh, a lack of understanding. Like it's ignorance in the purest form, like right, like it's ignorance without like any negative connotation. It's more like folks just don't know what the internet is. So that displays itself as, or that the way that emotion is expressed is through fear. Um, Ultimately, one way to address that is having a digital navigator or having at least, or whatever you want to call them, right? But having someone to sit with a community member and talk through what those fears might be, and then for really for like a digital navigator to like model browsing the internet with a community member who has expressed some fear and just sort of like talking through the this is what I'm doing. This is what the website is gathering from me right now. So as far as like those examples like cybersecurity and tracking or ads, like it's all of those things. If I would I can understand why anyone gets overwhelmed with seeing all of anything that pops up on a website, right? But it's helpful. It's helpful and instructive to have a digital navigator or adjacent type person um, working with a community member to sort of like essentially like talk through what those fears are. I don't know if that's helpful some of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't, you can definitely give me the signal if you really have to hop off, but to just take another minute or so,
Mhm.
it I feel like there's a sort of an insinuation in the question around something that might be in a lot in the back of a lot of people's minds when they're using um, technology that's connected to the World Wide Web or more, just more specifically, this engine that sort of logarithmically profiles us and pigeonholes us into being a certain type of user or having a certain type of user profile to where we might feel like we are now not seeing the full picture because we've been feeding into something that then feeds us back something similar and that reticence to kind of limit ourselves. And I don't know if I don't want to get too philosophical, but I think some more actualized users are kind of experiencing that in the back of their minds as like, how do I continue to nourish my online activity to where I know I'm seeing a full
Right.
picture
Yeah.
informationally, etc.
It's something I think about a lot. um, the one answer that I will give is that there are organizations and programs that like focus specifically on education around privacy and security on the internet that are and like the programs that they create are designed for, let's say, like a digital navigator type person to it's sort of like a train the trainer, like how a digital navigator type person might express to a community member um, what's going on around privacy and security on the internet. So one example is called the Library Freedom Project. Uh, Excellent program run by my friend Allison. And again, like for anyone who is either in direct service or manages direct service folks, like I would recommend that you look at the resources there. But on like the more personal level, yep. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, on the more personal level, I couldn't agree more. Like I am in a place where I'm very aware that I am trying to train my algorithm
Yes.
to give me more stuff that I want to see, or if I see something that is absolutely like not in line with the echo chamber that I'm building for myself, right? Like I'll just be like, no, I don't want to see this. This is wrong. Like the
Hmm.
algorithm, you messed up today. Um, yeah,
Very interesting. Thank you for kind of entertaining that idea with me as well. I think that that could maybe be an interesting educational piece for coalitions and organizations that are involved in online education, online, digital equity work, digital inclusion work to entertain as part of their sort of offerings. And I appreciate that. I don't see any other questions at this time. Thank you so much for giving us a run through of all of the great resources for having a good digital inclusion coalition. And I really hope that many communities in Illinois take this forward. So we're very grateful for your time.
of course. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about this stuff anytime. So. Yeah, thanks
Hello.
for having me.
Hi. I was wondering if I can ask a quick question as everyone's logging off because I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Like I'm very familiar with the Cleveland Project and it was so awesome. And someone's asking you to add your email to the chat. Um, do you see where the many coalitions form in like Cleveland and become its own entity? Or not. You know what I mean? Like, the Cleveland Coalition has basically went ahead and formed as a 501c entity. Is that necessary? Is that a way of
Oh,
saying success of the coalition? And then, yeah,
I see. Yeah, no. Yeah, I wouldn't say that like establishing oneself as a C3 is like an indicator of like now you've made it, right? Like you don't like that. It doesn't have to be that. There are plenty of coalitions across the country that still meet very informally, and are just are that collective of organizations who are like, I'm taking this, let's say, monthly meeting because this work is important and I need to stay plugged in and involved. So like if that's the level of effort that honestly is more common across the country, then do whatever you need to do. But ultimately, coalitions are good because they help lesser resourced communities and organizations like share pool resources. Like everyone wants to be doing this work, so coalitions are like one way to address that. A C3, nice. That's great, but not
not
necessary.
necessarily.
Yeah.
Gotcha. All right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
of
Thank you.
course.
Thank you again, Paolo. Thank you again, everyone. So we'll send out an email, but we'll have a few more sessions with this series coming up, recurring on these Wednesday at 1 p.m. So September 7 or August 7, 14, and 21. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.